High school bully attacks black girl, unaware her grandfather runs the city's underworld. What if the quietest girl in school was connected to the most dangerous man in the entire city? At Roosevelt High, power meant everything, and Brandon Whitaker thought he had it all. Popular, privileged, untouchable. But when he targeted Naomi Brooks, a black girl who never spoke a word back, he didn't know one thing. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was warning. Because Naomi's grandfather isn't just some old man, he's the shadow that powerful men in Chicago fear. And when the line is crossed, it's not the police who come knocking, it's something far worse. Stay tuned, because what happened next would shake the school, and the city, to its core. For months the quiet black girl silently endured his cruelty, but when he crossed the line her grandfather, the town's notorious mafia boss, made him pay. According to the laws of the underworld at Roosevelt High School in Chicago, standing out for the wrong reasons is a one-way street to misery. The 13-year-old black girl was quiet, and reserved an easy target in a school where power belonged to those who knew how to exploit the weak Naomi. Brooks had learned early on that silence was her best defense, but what made Aaliyah different from the other kids being bullied was that she never reacted, she never cried, never lashed out, never begged for help. She had learned to endure. Brandon Whitaker, on the other hand, had spent his entire life never hearing the word no. His father, Senator Thomas Whitaker, had built his political career on family values and law and order, but behind closed doors his son had been raised with a belief that power meant control. Brandon Whitaker lived like royalty at Roosevelt if he wanted someone. Gone they were gone if a teacher tried to discipline him. His father would make a call, and the next week that teacher would suddenly transfer to another school. He had never faced consequences a day in his life. When Brandon Whitaker first noticed Naomi Brooks, it wasn't just because she was quiet, it was because she was black. Roosevelt was a predominantly white school located in a well-off suburb, and while no one said it out loud, Naomi Brooks didn't belong, at least not in Tyler's mind, and so to him she was the perfect target. She had no close friends, no real allies, and worst of all, she refused to play along. That made her stand out in the worst way possible. The first time Brandon Whitaker saw her sitting alone at lunch eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich with her head slightly lowered, but not hunched, her shoulders relaxed, not tense, it irritated him. It wasn't the look of a victim, it was the look of someone simply existing outside the rules of Roosevelt, outside the hierarchy. He had carefully built that look, that quiet confidence, as if she didn't need the approval of anyone. Made his stomach twist with something he didn't understand. That feeling made him angry, so he decided to fix it. At first the bullying was subtle. He'd bump into her in the hallway, making her drop her books. He'd kick her chair in class. When she walked past his lunch table, he'd mutter just loud enough for her to hear, "Bet your mom's on food stamps." His friends would snicker, their privileged lives so far removed from hers that they found his cruelty amusing. Naomi Brooks never responded, and that annoyed him. Most kids who were bullied either ran or fought back. Naomi Brooks did neither. She simply looked at him, dark brown eyes, steady, unwavering. There was something about that stare that made Brandon Whitaker uneasy. It wasn't fear, it wasn't defiance, it was something else, something that made him feel small. It didn't matter that he was taller than her, that he had more friends, that he was part of the school's elite. When she looked at him like that, as if she saw right through him, it made his stomach turn. So he escalated one afternoon. In front of the entire cafeteria, Brandon Whitaker made his move. Naomi Brooks sat alone, as usual, at a corner table, quietly eating her peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Brandon Whitaker sauntered over, grabbed her lunch bag off the table, and held it up. "Let me guess," he said, shaking the bag. Government cheese. Laughter erupted around him. Some students turned away uncomfortably, but no one stepped in. That was how Roosevelt worked. Kids like Brandon Whitaker ran the place. Naomi Brooks sat still, watching him. Brandon Whitaker ripped open the bag and pulled out the sandwich. "This all you got? Damn, guess your daddy's too busy to pack you a real meal." Naomi Brooks didn't move. Brandon Whitaker wanted her to react. He wanted her to show fear, to give him something, but she just sat there looking at him with that same unreadable expression. That look infuriated him. He felt the laughter of the cafeteria around him, the way his friends were eating up the scene, waiting for the moment Naomi Brooks finally broke. With a dramatic flourish, he dropped the sandwich on the floor. The cafeteria gasped. Some kids chuckled, others just watched, waiting to see what Naomi Brooks would do. She didn't flinch. Brandon Whitaker, feeling a surge of power, took it a step further. He lifted his shoe and stomped down, smashing the sandwich into the floor. "Oops," he said, smirking. "Better pick that up, Carter. Ain't no food banks here to feed you." Laughter, loud, cruel, echoing across the room. But Naomi Brooks didn't look at the sandwich. She didn't even acknowledge it. Instead, she stood up, picked up her backpack, and walked out. She didn't cry, didn't run, just left. And that made Brandon Whitaker uneasy. That night, in a house 3 miles away from Roosevelt Middle School, Malcolm Brooks sat in his office, listening as his granddaughter quietly placed a phone on his desk. She didn't speak, she didn't have to. "Elia, He picked up the phone and looked at the screen. It was a photo one of Aya taken earlier that day, now doctored, distorted. Her face had been warped into a grotesque, exaggerated caricature. Across the top, bold white letters spelled out "Welcome to the Zoo." His grip on the phone tightened. Malcolm Brooks was not a man who spoke much at 68. He had lived through enough war, blood, and betrayal to know that anger was a useless emotion. It clouded. Judgment led to mistakes. He didn't get angry, he got. Even his granddaughter stood still, waiting. Finally Malcolm placed the phone down, took a slow sip of whiskey, and exhaled. Who did this? Naomi Brooks looked him in the eye. Brandon Whitaker. Malcolm leaned back in his chair. He had heard the name before. The senator's son. Naomi Brooks nodded. Malcolm Brooks smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile that made grown men shift uncomfortably in their seats. Then he just made the biggest mistake of his life. Malcolm Brooks had spent decades building his empire, an empire no one talked about openly, but everyone in Chicago understood existed. His name was never in the news, never on police reports, never spoken above a whisper in the circles that mattered. Yet he controlled more than most elected officials. Unlike Senator Donovan, whose power came from television cameras and election votes, Elliot's power was woven into the very fabric of the city. It was in the hands that moved businesses, the quiet favors that kept men in check, the unspoken rules that governed who was untouchable and someone had just touched his granddaughter. He wasn't impulsive. He never had been. That was why he was still alive, still in control, still sitting in his high-backed leather chair sipping whiskey, while men half his age were long gone. Power wasn't about making noise. It was about silence. It was about knowing exactly when to speak, and exactly when to let the weight of a name do the talking. That night, he made 3 phone calls. Each one was short to the point, and ended with a quiet understanding that something was about to shift. By morning, Roosevelt Middle School would no longer belonged to Brandon Whitaker. At exactly 11:42 p.m. Senator Thomas Whitaker's private landline rang. It wasn't a number he recognized, but he answered anyway. Power made men arrogant like that. He barely had time to say hello before the voice on the other end, deep, calm, and unmistakably in control, spoke. "You need to talk to your son." There was no introduction, no threats, no unnecessary words, just a simple statement that carried the weight of something Richard recognized immediately. Warning. He tried to push back, but the line went dead before he could get a word in. That was when he felt it, the cold grip of uncertainty clawing at the edges of his confidence. He had spent his career in politics, shaking hands with billionaires, standing behind podiums, making backroom deals. But this was different. This wasn't a negotiation. This wasn't a request. This was a man telling him very clearly that something had already been set in motion. By the time Brandon Whitaker woke up the next morning, the world around him had started to change. His phone buzzed with frantic messages from his friends. Something was wrong. The post about Naomi Brooks, the one he had spread across the school like wildfire, had vanished. Every comment, every share, every screenshot gone. Not just deleted, but erased so completely that even the students whispering about it in the hallways couldn't find a trace of it. He tried logging into his account, but it had been suspended. His email, his backup, even his secondary accounts locked out. He slid his phone down, frustration boiling over. Because this wasn't normal. This wasn't just some teacher taking disciplinary action. This was something else. Then came the second shift. Brandon Whitaker had always walked the halls of Roosevelt like he owned them. He had never had to look over his shoulder, never had to worry about whispers behind his back. But that morning as he moved through the school, he felt at the stairs the unease, the way students who had laughed with him yesterday now kept their heads down. He caught sight of his best friend Zach Coleman standing by the lockers, phone in hand, eyes darting nervously before he quickly turned away. Brandon Whitaker grabbed his arm. "What the hell is going on?" Zach Coleman hesitated. "I don't know, man, but people are saying—" He lowered his voice, glancing around, as if afraid of being overheard. "People are saying she's not just some random girl." Brandon Whitaker scoffed. "What does that even mean?" But the moment the words left his mouth, something in his gut twisted. He thought back to Naomi Brooks' face that day in the cafeteria, the way she had looked at him, the way she had walked away without a single reaction, as if she had already known how this would play out. Lunch period came, and for the first time in years Brandon Whitaker felt uneasy stepping into the cafeteria. He forced himself to act normal, striding toward his usual table, but as he did he noticed something strange. The kids, who had always been eager to be seen with him, to laugh at his jokes, to follow his lead, were avoiding his gaze. Even Chloe Mitchell, who had been right by his side when he humiliated Aaliyah, wouldn't meet his eyes. He sank into his seat, gripping his tray tighter than necessary. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than anyone. "This is getting ridiculous." Then his phone rang. He almost didn't answer. His father never called him during school hours, never. But the moment he saw the name flash across the screen, a cold wave of dread washed over him. He picked up. "Dad." His father's voice was different, tight, controlled in a way that sent alarm bells ringing in Tyler's head. "Listen to me carefully," Richard Donovan said, enunciating every word. "You're going to keep your head down for the rest of the day. You're going to go straight home. You're not going to say Another word to that girl, do you understand me? Brandon Whitaker blinked. Dad, what do you understand? Brandon Whitaker swallowed. Yeah, I got it. The line went dead. His fingers curled around the phone. Mind racing. His father was scared. Richard Donovan, the man who had bulldozed his way through political battles, who had never backed down from a confrontation in his life, was scared, and for the first time Brandon Whitaker wondered what exactly he'd gotten himself into. The final blow came after school. He was walking toward the parking lot when he noticed something unusual. His usual driver, a stiff no-nonsense man who had been picking him up since he was 12, wasn't there. Instead, parked right at the curb was a sleek black Cadillac. Two men in suits stood beside it, faces unreadable, watching him with the kind of gaze that made his skin crawl. The back door opened. Get in. It wasn't a request. Brandon Whitaker hesitated for the first time in his life. Who get in? He took a step back, heart pounding, but something in their expression told him there was no other option. Swallowing hard, he slid into the back seat. The door shut behind him with a quiet finality that made his stomach twist. The air inside the car was thick, heavy with the scent of leather and faint cigar smoke. Sitting across from him, legs crossed, a glass of whiskey balanced effortlessly in his hand, was a man Brandon Whitaker had never met, but somehow instinctively knew. Malcolm Brooks. The old man didn't speak right away. He simply took a slow sip of his drink, watching Brandon Whitaker with dark, assessing eyes, as if measuring how much trouble he was worth. Then, in a voice so calm it sent a shiver down Tyler's spine, he said, "You've been a very stupid boy." Tyler's mouth went dry. He tried to find his voice to explain, to deny, but before he could, Malcolm leaned forward, setting his glass down with deliberate care. "You think the world works the way your daddy told you it does? You think power is something you inherit, that it comes from money, from status, from knowing the right people?" His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're wrong." The car was moving now, the city passing in blurred streaks. Beyond the tinted windows, Brandon Whitaker couldn't tell where they were going. He didn't dare ask. Malcolm Brooks' continued, voice low and steady, "You made the mistake of thinking my granddaughter was like the other kids you push around, that she was alone, that she had no one watching out for her." He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "That was your second mistake." Brandon Whitaker swallowed. "What was my first?" Malcolm Brooks looked at him for a long moment, then leaned back, picking up his whiskey again. "You made me notice you." The car moved through the city streets in eerie silence, the hum of the engine the only sound between them. Brandon Whitaker sat rigid, his mind scrambling for a way out, for an explanation, for something that would make this all go away, but every time he opened his mouth to speak his throat closed up. He wasn't sure if it was fear or the way Malcolm Brooks's eyes bore into him, like he already knew every excuse Brandon Whitaker could come up with. He had spent his entire life in control, using his father's power as a shield. But here in this moment, sitting in the back of this car with a man who didn't need to raise his voice to be terrifying, Brandon Whitaker realized what true power looked like. Malcolm swirled the whiskey in his glass, letting the silence stretch. It was deliberate, suffocating. He had been in this game long enough to know that fear wasn't about screaming threats or throwing fists. It was about time, letting a man sit in his own mistakes, letting him drown in his own silence until he broke under the weight of it finally. When Brandon Whitaker had started to shift uncomfortably, Malcolm spoke. His voice is smooth and even as it had been before. "Tell me something, boy," he said, eyes still locked on Brandon Whitaker. "Did you think there'd be no consequences?" Tyler's jaw clenched. He wanted to say something smart, something defensive, something to reclaim the sliver of control he still had, but nothing came. Malcolm sighed, as if he was disappointed, but not surprised. "Your father, he has spent his life thinking the rules don't apply to him, that money can fix anything, that a title and a name make him untouchable, that arrogance was bound to pass down." He tilted his head, watching Brandon Whitaker with a kind of detached curiosity. "Tell me, do you think that too?" Brandon Whitaker swallowed hard. He wanted to say no, he wanted to lie, but something in Elliot's gaze told him that lying would be a mistake. Malcolm leaned forward, slightly resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't think you understand what's happening here. You see, your father makes laws, I make rules, and the difference between the two is that laws can be debated, rules." He smiled faintly, coldly. "Rules simply are." The car slowed to a stop. Brandon Whitaker glanced out the window, realizing they were in a part of Chicago he didn't recognize. It wasn't a bad neighborhood, but it wasn't somewhere someone like him would normally be. The door unlocked with a quiet click, but neither of the men in suits moved. Malcolm studied him for a moment longer, then said, "You're going to step out of this car, and you're going to go home. When you do, you're going to forget my granddaughter exists. You will not look at her, you will not speak her name, you will not even breathe in her direction if I hear otherwise." He let the sentence hang, letting Brandon Whitaker fill in the blanks. Brandon Whitaker exhaled shakily. Before nodding, he reached for the door handle, but before he could push it open, Malcolm spoke one last time, and Brandon Whitaker, the boy, froze. Elliot's smile returned, slow and deliberate. "If you ever even think about making this mistake again, I won't bother with warnings." Brandon Whitaker nodded again, quicker this time, and nearly stumbled out of the car. The door shut behind him, and the Cadillac rolled away, vanishing into the night like it had never been there. He stood there for a long moment, the cool air biting at his skin, his pulse still thundering in his ears. He had been threatened before by teachers, by school administrators, by kids who thought they were tougher than him, but this wasn't a threat, this was something absolute, something real. When he finally made it home, his father was waiting. The senator was standing in his office, drink in hand, face unreadable. For the first time in Tyler's life, there was no lecture, no ranting about responsibility, no promises that everything would be handled. Just silence, and that silence told Tyler everything he needed to know. His father wasn't in control this time. The next day at school, everything had shifted. The whispers followed him, but they weren't the same whispers of admiration or fear that he had been used to this time. There was something else, uncertainty, hesitation. People who had always stood beside him before now looked away. Even his closest friends kept their distance. It was as if overnight Brandon Whitaker had become nothing, and Naomi Brooks, she was exactly the same. She didn't gloat, didn't acknowledge him, didn't act as if anything had changed at all. She simply walked through the halls as if he were invisible, and for the first time in his life Brandon Whitaker felt what it was like to be powerless. Malcolm Brookser never called again. He didn't need to. The lesson had already been taught. Brandon Whitaker had been removed from the game, and in doing so a new rule had been written in the unspoken laws of Roosevelt Middle School. Naomi Brooks was not to be touched ever. She had won without ever lifting a finger, and in the world Malcolm Brooks had built, that was the kind of power that lasted. But the effects of that night didn't just stop at Roosevelt. The senator, normally a man who walked into every meeting with an air of invincibility, suddenly looked older, more cautious. He began turning down public events, retreating into private meetings, as if he suddenly understood that he had been playing in a world far more dangerous than politics. His political rivals sensed it, though none of them knew why. The media speculated about health issues, stress, scandal, but the truth was simpler. He had been reminded that there were powers greater than money, greater than votes. For Brandon Whitaker, life never returned to what it was. He tried to regain control, tried to act like nothing had changed, but the school had already moved on. The kids who had once followed him blindly now hesitated, uncertain. His best friend Zach Coleman, once his closest ally, stopped sitting with him at lunch. Teachers who had once feared reprimanding him now seemed indifferent, as if his last name had lost its weight. Even at home his father had little patience for him anymore. Conversations were short-clipped, and for the first time Brandon Whitaker felt like a liability instead of an asset. And Naomi Brooks, she continued on, untouched, unbothered, unshaken. She never looked for revenge. She never tried to get back at him, because she had never needed to. One afternoon months later, Brandon Whitaker found himself standing by his locker, staring at nothing in particular, lost in thought. He hadn't spoken to Naomi Brooks since that day. He hadn't dared, but as she passed him in the hallway, for the briefest moment their eyes met, there was no malice in her gaze, no gloating, no lingering satisfaction, just that same steady, unreadable expression she had always worn. And somehow that made it worse, because Brandon Whitaker realized something then. She had never been afraid of him, not once, not for a second. He had spent his whole life believing that power was something that could be taken, controlled, wielded, but Malcolm Brooks had taught him the truth in a single night. Real power didn't need to announce itself, it simply existed. And now Brandon Whitaker understood. He had never been the predator, he had always been the prey. Sometimes, the strongest power doesn't come from fists or fame, but from knowing who truly stands behind you. Naomi didn't fight back, because she didn't have to. Her quiet strength spoke louder than any outburst ever could, and in a world that often rewards loudness, that kind of silence is revolutionary. But here's a question for you. Should someone's background determine how they're treated? Or better yet, would Tyler have backed off if Naomi hadn't had a powerful grandfather? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you see the world differently, then don't just scroll. Hit that like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to Soulful Stories V. Because the truth is, some stories aren't just meant to be told. They're meant to be felt.